Good afternoon, Bitcoin world. My name is Ian Gillespie, and today we will be discussing the power of perpetual preferreds and how this can make Bitcoin treasuries virtually unstoppable. Today we will be looking at Strategy's newest instrument, Stretch, and how it can potentially turn $100 into $150,000 worth of pure Bitcoin growth. As always, this is not financial advice. Let's get started. First, we must understand what a perpetual preferred is. So a perpetual preferred acts as a bond with no maturity date. That no maturity date is what makes it perpetual. So for example, the product that we'll be looking at today, Stretch, ticker STRC, aims to pay about a 9% annual dividend on their product while having a consistent share price that's designed to continuously trade at around $100. So with that, every share of the product that's issued, Strategy raises about $100, and that $100 never matures or has to be paid back, thus making the instrument perpetual. So with this, Strategy only has to pay $9 per year in dividends on every share of the product based on the targets that this product aims at providing for investors. A common misunderstanding with perpetual preferreds, such as Stretch, is that Bitcoin has to either meet or exceed the dividend rate that they're paying out to be for the instrument to work. However, that is not necessarily the case. For example, Bitcoin's growth rate is compounded annually, while Stretch, ticker STRC, is not compounded at all since the dividends are paid in cash, and Strategy is just aiming to keep the share price at around $100 and has instruments in place to either slightly raise or slightly lower the price if it gets higher or lower. So if someone wanted to compound their dividends or compound their growth with Stretch, they could theoretically do so by buying more shares of Stretch with the dividends that they receive. So for example, if they purchase one share of Stretch and pay $100 into the product, receive $9 after 1 year of holding the product, then they can compound this by paying $9 back into the product. However, with this, they would pay $9 into Stretch. Strategy would receive that $9 while only paying back 9% per year on that $9. So after 1 year of that extra $9 being in there, Strategy would have to pay less than $1 back on that. So while investors could potentially get compounding growth on this product by buying back shares and buying back into the product, Strategy does not necessarily have to compound their interest. So they're essentially just paying $9 on every $100 that they're issuing in shares. That is essentially the aim of the product. With this strategy, it would take over 11 years for the interest that is paid on dividends to equal the $100 that Strategy originally raised to be able to buy Bitcoin now. So let's take a look at how this kind of works without Bitcoin needing to grow to extremely large numbers. Let's take a look at Bitcoin just growing at about a 4% annual rate. So in this case, Strategy would raise $100 per share issued of perpetual preferreds, and they could use that to buy Bitcoin. And then after 11 years, that $100 of Bitcoin would now be worth $154 worth of Bitcoin if Bitcoin was growing at 4% annually, while Strategy only paid out $100 in dividends at that 11-year mark. So then Strategy at that point is still paying non-compounding dividends on this $100 at 9% per year, while they are receiving compounding growth on not just $100 of Bitcoin, but $154 of Bitcoin because they were able to buy more earlier. Again, this is just assuming that Bitcoin is growing at a measly 4% annual growth rate. So now let's chart it out. On the left column here, I have the years after the inflection point. That inflection point is the 11 years it takes for Strategy to pay out in dividends the amount of capital that it originally received. So as we previously discussed, it would take about 11 years for them to pay out $100 per share in dividends when they received those $100 straight out. So this is the inflection point that we are kind of basing this upon. So the first year after that inflection point, which would be essentially 12 years after that stretch was purchased or issued, Strategy would pay out $9 that year on dividends, and they would receive $6.16. They wouldn't necessarily receive that, but that would be essentially their growth on that 4% of the $154 of value of Bitcoin that they hold. Because again, after 11 years, that $100 at a 4% rate has grown into $154 worth of Bitcoin. So after the first year of that inflection point, they would have essentially gotten $6.16 worth of growth on Bitcoin. Now, while this does seem counterintuitive, does not seem like it's the best strategy because they are growing less than they are paying out in dividends for that year. However, this is not necessarily the entire story. So strategy at that point, after 12 years or after after that first year of that inflection point, they have paid out $108 worth of dividends while they have grown their value of their Bitcoin holdings to $160. So they would still theoretically be in the green at this point. And as you can see, throughout this entire cycle here, at every single point, the value of their Bitcoin holdings has still grown more than the total amount of dividends that they have had to pay out. So in theory, this strategy would work. Now, quick disclaimers, strategy would not necessarily be able to do this at this full capacity because for these perpetual preferreds to work, they wouldn't be able to just take the funds and put 100% of what they receive into Bitcoin for the instrument to work, just in case they need to raise dividends to raise the price back up, anything like that. They would want to have a little bit of cash on the side there too. So this strategy wouldn't necessarily get this full scale effect that you're seeing here, but it is a good kind of conceptual idea to show you that Bitcoin does not necessarily need to grow at that 9% that strategy is paying out for this product to necessarily work. Now let's take a look at a more bullish scenario, what I think is a more realistic scenario of Bitcoin growing at an annual rate of 20%. So let's take a look at what happens if Bitcoin grows at 20% per year for 11 years. So again, if strategy is paying $9 in dividends per year for 11 years, that would get them to $99 worth of dividends. That would be the inflection point, essentially, where that they've paid the amount of dividends. They've paid the same amount of dividends as the capital that they originally received from this product. So if Bitcoin grew by 20% over every year for 11 years, that would essentially be a 6.2x in their Bitcoin growth that they were able to get. So what that means is that after 11 years, Strategy has essentially received $620 per share worth of Bitcoin while having only paid out $100 worth of dividends per share of Stretch. And then again, this is assuming all funds were used to buy Bitcoin. So this wouldn't necessarily be the case. This is more just an example to be able to conceptually understand the power of these kinds of instruments, of these perpetual preferreds. So let's go ahead and chart it out. After that first year of inflection, after that first year where the dividend payouts has equaled the amount of capital that Strategy receives, they again paid out $9 in dividends. And then just that year alone, they received or they didn't receive, but they grew $124 worth of their Bitcoin holdings. Again, this is taking 20% that year in Bitcoin growth on the $620 worth of Bitcoin that they have at that point, because that $100 worth of Bitcoin over 11 years grew to $620 worth of Bitcoin. So just that first year after that inflection point alone, they have $124 worth of growth in Bitcoin. And then the total dividends they paid out at that point would be $108, while the dollar value of their Bitcoin holdings has grown to $744. And then let's take a look going all the way down to 30 years. Again, after 30 years of this happening, so that would essentially be 41 years after Stretch was originally purchased, because 30 years on top of that inflection point. Um, Strategy would again pay $9 in dividends that year, and they would receive $35,000 just that year alone on just their Bitcoin growth. So then at that point, after 41 years or 30 years after that 11-year inflection point, the total dividends Strategy would have paid is $369 per share of Stretch, while their value of their Bitcoin holdings from being able to buy Bitcoin directly at the point that they did from receiving that money earlier is $147,000. Again, this is assuming that Strategy was able to put 100% of the capital from these funds into Bitcoin for these instruments to work. That would not necessarily be the case, but this is just giving you a conceptual understanding of the power of perpetual preferreds. And if Bitcoin grew at greater than a 20% average growth rate per year, this number could be significantly higher. In my opinion, 20% is honestly a little bit more conservative, especially if you take into consideration how fast the dollar is losing value on top of how fast Bitcoin is growing as well. So I think 20% is a little bit conservative. But regardless, this presentation was mostly just giving you a good understanding on how to conceptualize the power of perpetual preferreds. That is all I have for you guys today. Thank you so much for watching. If you like this video, if you like the videos I've been putting out, please consider liking and subscribing to support my work and to support the channel.